So I'd like to get going. We'll first hear from our speakers. We have a very, very interesting panel in here. And what I would like to do is ask them to introduce themselves briefly so we know their expertise from the best way that they can. And if they are too modest, I'll intervene and correct that for you, because one of our main leading ideas in online learning environments sessions is we're bringing people from very different areas of expertise. We're bringing people from architecture, for instance, Dr. Tanzer here. We're bringing people from education, Dr. Chiu here. And we're bringing people who are practitioners who are in this business and have a practical and aesthetic sense, like Andrew's helping us with the designer, will help us get some of these issues, because we want to get into some practical components of it. And one thing I hope we can do is at some point do a demo, like a live critiquing of a site. You might have heard of it, it's called Collab. To see if it aesthetically needs some change or not. So we'll talk about all these. So could I have the speakers go one by one? You can start from Dr. Tanzer. So just briefly introduce yourself. What are you doing? What is your position at UVA?
My name is Tanzer. I'm Dean of the School of Architecture. I'm an architect by training and a longtime faculty member in design studios. My focus at UVA since I arrived in 2009 has been linking our faculty's knowledge into clusters of research themes or swarms that are focused on the world's grand challenges. And I have also been focusing on bringing design thinking into the curriculum. That's a term that we'll probably use some more today.
I'm Jennie Chiu. I'm an assistant professor at the Curry School of Education. I'm in the Science, Technology, Engineering, and Math Education group, the STEM education group. I design and research online learning environments for students learning specifically science and engineering. And in particular, I study how people learn from visualizations. So whether it be dynamic visualizations or simulations, and how to help support students in these technology-enhanced environments.
I'm Chesnut. I'm a designer. I've worked on projects like Open Grounds here at the university. My design background's sort of in 3 chapters. I first worked in New York for a large for one of the top 5 design firms, and then went out on my own, and also taught at Cooper Union. Then my next chapter was in Italy, where I worked as a designer, but also taught for American universities. I was grandfathered into the University of Maryland's Computer Science Department with my MFA, because I've been involved with the onset of Macs and graphic implications way back at the beginning in New York. And then my last chapter, and longest chapter, has been here in Charlottesville, but my work has been national, not just located in Charlottesville. Some of the early, I worked on a number of very early websites, internal ones for startups out of Silicon Valley from here, like Oracle, which you've now heard of. And I've also, related to this conversation, was involved with PBS with their foray into online learning, which was in the 90s, because they had long been a provider to community colleges for their educational materials, and looking at it, the web as a new source for doing that. That morphed into working with WIDA, which had 3, they're 10 years old now, but have 3 significant sites for internet learning that not just reaches teachers in educators, but also parents and students. Reading Rockets, which is literacy development, Coloring Colorado, which is their bilingual site, and then LD Online, which is for learning disabilities.
That's great. Now you can see why we were very excited, because if you ever had to talk about art and aesthetics and online learning, these are the 3 people you really want to hear from. So let's get the conversation started. One of the things we do usually is, let's look at the offline environment very briefly. And because people always like art and aesthetic, okay, why is that important? So probably the first question we have to tackle, why is it important? And let's look at the physical environment. Dr. Tanzer, when you're thinking about architecture of spaces and education context as well, why is art and aesthetic, together or separate, important at all? If somebody told you, I don't care.
Well, I think physical environments can be helpful for learning in a couple of ways. One is that they create what David Orr describes as crystallized pedagogy, that the way that you learn physically, that the space shapes the way we learn in some fashion. So that's one thing in that it's an active participant, and that might, as an example, if you're trying to learn about how a community operates, you might go and visit the community to really feel it with your embodied presence. This goes back to the work of John Dewey and others in the early 20th century who were looking at learning through experience. So the space shapes your experience, whatever the space is. I think that to a less profound degree, any space either provides friction or a lack of friction for learning, and that friction can be a good thing or a bad thing. So when I started practicing architecture, I actually first taught elementary school art, and ironically one of my first jobs was to do the demolition drawings for a school that I had previously taught in, which was kind of interesting. That those earlier schools from the 40s and 50s oftentimes had large windows and lots of them. In the 70s and 80s, we went through a period where somebody had the good idea that if you don't provide students windows, they won't be distracted and look outside. And I think the research has shown that actually hasn't worked out so well, that it made everybody probably irritated, and that daylight is a good thing for all kinds of things, and probably distractions are good as well, to refresh your mind and so forth. So I think that all spaces can either be annoying and make it harder to learn, or make it easier to learn, and I haven't really looked at this very much, but I would propose that one of the nice things about this space is the fact that it has tall ceilings and large windows and nice light. So there's plenty of space for all of us to kind of look around and to daydream a little bit in the midst of what it is that we're concentrating on, and that the act of being able to daydream allows us to plunge back in and learn more deeply.
So one of the things that comes to mind right away is, okay, large windows, tall ceilings. What does that mean online? And I want to ask, when I talk about like the space, in the online environment and lots of light, we sometimes talk about the existence of a white space on a page, for instance, and things that are crammed as opposed to things that have a lot of padding so they can breathe. Do you come across these issues when you're designing online environments?
Of course. The white space is not so much space as an emptiness, but it's how you organize the page to guide the viewer's eye through the material. I mean, if you've looked at some recent textbooks, sometimes there's so much going on. I think that they're going to prompt me to have a learning disability because I don't know where to go. But with the online situation, it's different than the traditional textbook. You don't have a spine. And a spine is a very simple clue as to how big something is. How much is in that? Is it an encyclopedia book, or is it just a little throwaway? And most people aren't going to go look at a site map to figure out how big the site is. So when you think about organizing the page online, you have to keep that in mind as how you're going to flow people through the information, because you can't put it all on one page, and that's become one of the things that's happened with landing pages or the home pages of sites. People want to tell you the table of contents, the index, and the book cover all at once. And if you're like me, and I know the site I want to go to, I don't even bother with it. I go to some simple part of the site and work backwards from there, so I don't have that load time. So it can work for you and against you.
And if you go back again a step to physical environments, let's look at the architecturally, but also aesthetically as well. When you look at a school, for instance, what do you think is engaging or important in terms of aesthetics? Like in my school, for instance, as I was learning, there was a general emphasis on things being on the wall. Just all sorts of things, things being hung up, arts, other established things to be put up there. But when you go on online learning environments, it's very barren of any influence of somebody has been here, because it clears itself off. There are discussion boards, other things. So how do you feel this transition should happen? Or do you think that art or aesthetic on the walls, for instance, is an important part of the student experience or anybody's experience?
Well, I guess there are two kinds of things that are put on the walls. One is things placed by the teachers that are part of the pedagogy to prompt you to think about things. And I'm thinking about in elementary school classrooms where it's the letters or turkeys on Thanksgiving or whatever. And in a university environment, within classrooms, they typically go away, right? Because we use different classrooms. In our school, at the same time, we have posters up for lectures that are placed by inhabitants of the building, not necessarily, I mean, some of them are intended to communicate, but they're not part of the pedagogy in the same way that things in elementary school classrooms are, and that might be an important distinction. I mean, I guess the other thing that I would say is, and I'm with Anne, I think, in terms of white space, that for me, if there's too much information, it loses a sense of hierarchy, and sometimes, and I think this is probably personally, people probably feel differently about this. I think some people pack a lot of stuff on the page so that it will look interesting and exciting and rich. I find that to be annoying myself. But I have colleagues actually who like to have just absolutely everything on all pages all the time to demonstrate apparent, in my mind, apparent richness. And so I think that's another differentiation.
That's one of the things we'll come to a lot, I think, how much information. And I know Dr. Chiu has done a lot of research on this. We will come to the online aspect of it, but you're also a science teacher. And when you think about textbooks and how things are organized, illustrations, simulations, do you think there were challenges in terms of how they were aesthetically put in there that actually hindered learning?
Well, I kind of wanted to go back, sorry. All these things that first with the meaning of art and having art and aesthetics in learning environments. For science is creative. Scientists and engineers and mathematicians are very creative, and I feel like art sort of promotes that sort of muscle. For those students to think that science is not just memorizing facts, or engineering is not just learning a bunch of math equations, but it's actually this process. I have to admit, I'm an undergraduate in product design, and so design thinking has always been the forefront of what I try to do and what we try to instill with the students. But in terms of course, the textbooks, when I was trying to think about what to say about art and aesthetics, art, for some reason, queued up to me information processing. So just thinking of how do people perceive what you put on a page in an online environment, and what choices you make in terms of white spaces, in terms of color, and I'm sure I'm going to defer to the graphic designer. Really influences where students pay attention, where you are supposed to go, if you can make sense of something, if you can't make sense of something, but if you have a ton of information on a page. For me, it queued up, information processing in terms of the art. In aesthetics, for me, it seemed to be more of a philosophical stance and more of a reflection. And what I loved about my experiences in art classes was the natural, reflective process, the natural sort of, you were always taking some sort of a stance or having to look at and think about art. And from a learning perspective, reflection is extremely important, but in classrooms and in online environments, it's very hard to promote, right? So if you think of your K-12 learning experiences, then it's usually you just keep adding ideas, you don't stop to think. And so I thought that was a nice sort of tie into how can we promote these types of thinking within these learning environments. I'm sorry, I don't think I answered your question.
Oh, no, you
Sorry, and I'll just do one last thing. I think it's building off of what Kim said. It's really important to have these types of shared representation, these external artifacts for students and people to be able to come to a common agreement, right? So in here, it's using the white spaces so that you can articulate your ideas, and then other people can either build upon or refine their ideas, or try to figure out the communication process. And I think it is really important to have those types of artifacts in an online space. The best way to do that, I don't think we're still negotiating within context, but it is very important to have those types of external representations for communication.
It might be like a Sidebar Pinterest or Tumblr type page that was part of another site.
Right.
Well, there's another aspect that I've thought about this. When you go back to the elementary school classroom, you always think about you're going to give the information 3 ways, for those that feel it, those that hear it, those that see it. And that a lot of the online that we think about is mostly reading visual. I mean, you can turn on a sound component. We're just beginning to have the touch component with tablets and whatnot, but you don't have that multiple level of reinforcement. So you have to think about also how you construct the page, that you reach different ways of learning, not the other. And that gets back to the question of creativity in science and art. I think that when you learn different kinds of arts, you learn different paths of thinking. Music teaches you one way to process information. Math teaches you another. The visual arts another. So if you can have those references as part of the learning, then you're giving another set of channels for people to think through the material.
And actually, I know Dr. Chiu, for instance, this is an area that's constantly developing. How can we replicate real-world experiences online? And Dr. Tanzer also touched on this, to embodied experiences, for instance, which does play into how the art and aesthetic of it is actually played out. And Dr. Chiu is doing some research on actually embodied experiences in learning. So where is this field right now?
I feel like it's in its infancy. I guess I shouldn't say that, because there are people who have been doing research in embodied cognition and grounded cognition for a long time. I feel like the technological capabilities have finally caught up to where, so when we mean sort of natural user interfaces or embodied cognition, is that there's something about doing this with a paintbrush as opposed to doing this with a mouse, right? That it cues up the realm or your past experiences about color, about painting, about holding the brush, right? That's very different than your past experiences about holding a mouse and clicking. There are people that have been, researching this, and of course, just like you were saying, it's just different pathways. So if you have it verbally, if you have it auditorially, if you have it also sort of embodied, then it's a much richer experience for people to draw upon, and they encode it in different ways in their brain. And so what Jennie is referring to, I was actually there this morning with my name tag. We're trying to build in these types of experiences for students so that they can push on a computer screen and see some sort of resulting motion, or they can heat something up. They can bring a bottle of cold water over to a bunch of molecules and see what happens. So they have the tactile feeling of something cold or something hot, and then the scientific, in our case, it's the visualization of what happens that they can't see in the world that the computer brings to them. So I guess it's hard because online learning environments, sometimes they're meant to just replace physical learning environments, right? Which is fantastic. For those of you who heard the Coursera talk last week, I think it was last week, bringing access to education to people in South Africa or people who don't have the means to these wonderful experiences. But then there's also technology where you try to leverage the affordances of technology. So you try to give students or learners something that they cannot have in real life, right? So there are sort of two ways of thinking about online learning spaces. So I guess I don't have anything particular to say. I kind of push for in my own research, push for what are the ways that we can take advantage of technology that enable us to do many different things than we could in the real world, as opposed to just trying to duplicate what we already have. But there's nothing wrong with the other way as well.
Which kind of brings me to the question of, and Dr. Tanzer can answer to this too. So far, what we thought of online was probably an extension of print. So I guess if you looked at it, okay, text will be here, picture will be there. Okay. So I'm thinking, are we thinking that way actually? No.
I don't think that way, and I think you have to think of the web not that way, because in print, things are sequential. You don't have to enter the book from start to finish, but it's bound and it's sequential. The web's not because of links, and so how you move through it is going to be different for each person. That's one sense of web. So the idea of calling pages on the web is a bit of a misnomer, and it becomes even more of a misnomer when you're talking about a website that's database driven, where you put in the components of the information you want, and the page you get is going to be unique to your request, such as some of the sites, like iPad. I worked on the Leonardo site for iPad. So if I'm putting in components there, I'm getting a database set of information that's unique to my request. So I don't think you can think about them having the same characteristics, the same type of use, and therefore you have to define how you want to organize the information in a different way.
I think there are also cases of online courses that are trying to replicate the lecture hall experience, which is even worse, and it's unfortunately what we know how to do, right? and so I think there's that problem. And we were talking in our school this morning about this, and everyone who's been teaching as long as I have thinks of thought in 45-minute packages with room for questions at the end. And that's not, there's nothing required about that. It's just sort of the way it's grown over 100 or more years. And so I think that transferring and understanding it's not only not a book and sequential, it also isn't a lecture. And so then thinking about what it could be is something that I'm not aware of many faculty who have had time to consider comprehensively. You know, I have colleagues in other places who flip their classes, and perhaps some of you do as well, where you record a short lecture that the students review beforehand, and then they come into the classroom and have discussions about what they heard before. Maybe that's the beginning of the start, but when I think about all of the things that all of us and our students experience online, from the sophistication of TED Talks to shopping on Amazon to, you know, Facebook and Pinterest and other things like that, I think that we're in the academy pretty significantly behind.
Dr. Chiu, why do you think that is in education? Because we're in that field, and our thought is that, well, we should be spearheading this, making it much better, making the interaction much better. Is it because of what we're used to? Or do you think the technology is in a place where it's ready, where you can actually start to respond to some of these problems?
Well, I think it's a matter of professional development. And it takes, I was just talking to one of my colleagues yesterday, she's transitioning her course to be online, and she said last week she spent 40 hours just on that one course alone, and just trying to figure out exactly how to put everything up on Colab. And then the week before that, she spent just 20 hours, and so it's an incredible amount of time for a faculty member to try to put together even a basic online course. You know, just recording lectures, doing all that. So I think there's a tremendous startup and activation cost in order to get things online. But then there's I feel like design and research learning environments where students are collaborating on ideas and having these different experiences with simulations and that type of thing. But still, I'm not an expert, and if I were to design a course online, it would take many, many years of refinement. And so I think that we're just at the beginning, like you were saying, of making this transition and then trying to figure out what are the best ways. I mean, do we have them, we want to take advantage of the time that we have people together in class, right? So how do we do that? We want to take advantage of what we assign out to be, perhaps individualized learning or group learning outside of class, and it's just a different way of thinking that would require anybody to, there's a little bit of lag time for people to come around. But that being said, I don't want to talk about Colab, but when you're constrained by certain technologies, it also constrains what you can do, right? So we're also limited by some of the bigger choices, specifically here.
So that actually comes to the crux of the problem, because if you work on the design field or programming field, I think it has come quite far. Actually, we can do interactive elements relatively easily compared to a long time ago. So then the question is like, the people who are actually designing this, what do we need to change in terms of the structure of how, for instance, an online environment gets designed? Let's say UVA decided right now we want to make our own online learning environment. Who should they talk to? Who should they train? And what kind of clues from, for instance, architecture should they take? Because UVA, for instance, has a very significant, let's start with architecture. UVA has a very significant architecture. And I was in an interview today, and when they asked me, what should UVA preserve when switching online, and I said, well, there's a sense of place, environment, and tradition. And this is really put in the architecture, and when you look at the building, you realize that there's an institutional value being put on it. You say, okay, this is the institution that I am in. Should we do that in online learning, or is it a good thing, bad thing? How can we go about doing that?
I think the reason the lawn has been such an enduring presence and service of education is because it's so flexible in a way. When I look at it, I don't look at columns of a certain color or proportion. I look at a kind of a clear hierarchy. There are small rooms for a few people. They happen to be students. There are larger buildings interspersed. They happen at this time to be for deans and others to live in. They used to be classrooms. There's something at the head of that cluster that is obviously more important than anything else because it's the only round thing. So there's a legibility in the space that transcends time and transcends usage. So if this became some other kind of institution or collection, if everyone left and 200 years from now people came back and found it, the way they would occupy the space would be informed by the scale of the spaces. And I think that's the contribution that Jefferson made. And I don't think that has to do with tradition so much as with flexibility in a way, but legible flexibility. It can be some things, but not all things.
It's also it's a hierarchy of organization that is very clear, and that's the thing you need on the web is this really clear sense of what's the most important thing, what's next, and what's next, which is exactly what the buildings do, that we need to do on the website as well. There are two other things to think about in the discussion of what Jennie was saying about online learning, because I've worked on this in the field of not providing within the university students, but providing to students out there that are alone, is thinking about that lecture model you were talking about and the model of discussion. How does the discussion take place when you have students working independently? And that coming together and doing a Sidebar something is maybe not the best way to do a discussion. So that's one question. The other question goes back to another piece of one of your questions, and that's how we harness what we see on Amazon and everything else. The advertising's ahead of us. They know what we've looked at, and that pair of boots or whatever shows up adjacent to our mail or somewhere else. Sidebars could be treated the same way in providing educational material. If you know the student has gone and linked and looked at a specific question, then there's a sidebar with more of that information that could come up on the page, using it as a database driven.
So would you say that in terms of thinking about architecture that online should be modular? Because it feels to me like when we redesign a web page, we're completely taking everything out and completely redesigning it. It's like you go to school the next day, it's a new school. Do you feel that it's that much of an intense change for people? Or do you find some modular elements, like there's always a sidebar, and the sidebar will have modules, or there's different ways of interacting with it?
I don't think you would ever put anything in that much of a box. And this is a really simple example, but I can put a page number any place I want on a page of a book. I've even seen a book where it's been put in the center of the page. Doesn't bother any of us. We all say it's fair, you can put it anywhere. What does bother us is if we change the rules within that publication. So if it's in the center of this page and on the left on this page, then I don't like it. And I think that we all have the ability to look at the web page as an open canvas, just like when a painter starts down to start painting, and that if it's well organized, then the viewer knows how to move through that canvas. And that if your secondary and tertiary pages have that same sense of hierarchy or skeleton underlying it, then the viewer knows what to do with each of those pages. So I don't think you ever want to say, we have to have a sidebar.
And maybe I'm just kind of blowing the top off, but if you think of, I'm teaching a course on simulation and games right now, educational simulation and games. And And we just read a paper about how students or people playing World of Warcraft. I don't know if you've heard of World of Warcraft, but it's this massively multiplayer online game. If you look at their chat, they're actually engaging in a lot of scientific practices. They're using evidence, they're making models of what wizards and things build together in order to defeat the boss. And these types of experiences, I know Second Life was really big, like 10 years ago. People have been teaching in Second Life, but in a web-enabled or in a technology-enhanced environment, you could imagine people going into an immersive environment and discovering what it was like to be in the French Revolution, or going back and figuring out, when I'm going through China at a certain period of time, what were the other influences that were going on. And so, a sidebar, I'm just thinking, a sidebar probably wouldn't be the best thing. But maybe it would, because they do have sidebars in the games, but to sort of think a little bit more flexibly about online environments.
So if we want to take a little bit of a practical aspect, and I know everybody has an experience of this, and we've been talking about space a lot too, which was part of our main topic last time, and I'm seeing that we can't escape it. Whenever we're talking about an online environment, whatever the topic, we will talk about space. So let's look at something a bit more concretely. I'm looking at maybe color palettes that they're used, spacing that is used. We don't need to go into it, but Collab behind you can see, and generally, which to remind you, Collab is based on Sakai, which I think is a great accomplishment. It's a free-to-use software. It's a great tool for universities, and we do not at all want to undermine the work that has been put in there. It's a great work, and it's helped a lot of educational environments and situations. So, having said that, we do have frustrations with it. Some of it maybe with space, some of it maybe with the way that the aesthetics is used. So, if you look at it for instance for a while, you can jump in here too, any of our listeners. Would you have anything to say about how Collab could be improved? If you put on your designer lens, architect lens, say maybe there's more space.
Faculty lens.
Faculty
lens. I'm sure everyone here has some thoughts.
Right.
So let's start with the aesthetics first. Does it look nice? Look engaging to you?
No.
No.
Okay. You could give suggestions to the people who are doing it. What kind of things would we think about? Like there's a sidebar there, for instance. Is it useful? Is it not useful? What could we change about some of these elements?
What are you calling the sidebar?
The blue part that is always there, it is contextual, so it changes.
That looks like more like navigation than a
Yes,
sidebar.
true. That looks more like.
That's why I asked you what's the sidebar. I mean, that.
So, what do you think? Would you change anything about this?
Well, there's lots of places to go. So if we just talk about your toolbar over there, there are ways to highlight where you are and you're not there that would be easier for people to read. I mean, right now, the grayed out area you have is such a deep value that any student that has a visual impairment is going to have trouble reading what their other choices are. So there's aesthetic problems and there are functional problems. And they really need to be resolved in tandem. So that's a start.
It seems like it was designed by computer programmers, and I don't know if it was or not, but I just think that as a user, I mean, I teach a class once a year, but not two every semester, so I'm a relatively infrequent user, although I certainly use other sites, and I forget how to use it almost every single time. It's really not intuitive.
I was going to say that. I don't use it very often. I use it with various different groups who want to provide me information, much in the way faculty would provide student information. And I have the same problem that it's not intuitive, so that I have to think through how I'm going to get the material. And it's and because of that, people don't necessarily know how to put things up. So if somebody's feeding me a large image file, I should have, if they put it up one way, I can just download it and get the image. If they put it up another way, I have to wait for that image to draw before I can copy it, which illustration.
So
It's the interface can be a lot simpler.
So in terms of like making a connection to architecture, would it be accurate? We don't know how it was actually designed, the process, but it does give me at least the feeling that if you're thinking of the needs for online learning as a building, it looked like they made a part of the building and then somebody else came and made another part of the building. Somebody else made an addition to that building, and then what they realize is what this building is doing is kind of similar to what that building is doing, but because it was added on to each other, eventually you lose kind of the sense of what is this building generally doing. So, but how would you, as an architect who is intimately knows the process of building something, how could we avoid this? How could we anticipate what will happen later so we can build for it? Or in terms of design and architecture, what is the solution to this problem?
Well, I'm thinking about a parallel to this in physical space, and I mean, for me, the problem using this site is it's hard to find my way around in a very simple way, and I forget where I've been, and I can't remember where I put things and all that kind of stuff. And so thinking of a physical parallel, I would say almost any university medical center, including the one that's nearby, has that same problem, and it is in part that they've been added onto over time, and they've kind of made things, you know, work, which is what I understand you're saying about collab. I mean, if you can start again, that's always the best thing, because then, and if you think about airports that you've been in, there are some that similarly have been added onto over time. Charlotte is not my favorite airport for that reason. You know, it's hard to find your way around. There are others that, and I know Atlanta's very busy, but it was made to be added onto, so they can keep adding terminals, and there's a train that runs between them. So there's a kind of a clear logic that it will be added onto over time. So either you have to start with that, or the only other way to deal with something is to, and this is what university hospitals do, to edit or to add imageable points of navigation, I guess you could say. So in hospitals you see like atriums that are built in, or color coding on floors or other things like that. There aren't that many good examples of making old clunky buildings more understandable, but those are the kind of things you can do. You kind of have to subtract or highlight things, and I guess that if this site is a given, having someone who's a really good graphic designer, which is not the same person who wrote the code, go back in and edit it would be the best thing to do.
It's sort of like site mapping subways.
Yeah,
the London subway, the lines go like this, they can color code, and then suddenly the Jubilee line makes sense.
Yeah.
So if you're stuck with this, then you need to take a chapter from the London Underground.
One of the challenges people bring about this, and in terms of aesthetics, is accessibility. What if you have a colorblind person come to the website? So how limiting is that? Because we definitely need to address this. We can't be like, oh, we don't care if somebody's colorblind. So our site should be accessible and readable by everybody. Is that a limiting factor when we think about design?
Anytime you work with design, you have a set of limitations, and your job is to solve a problem based on the restrictions that situation presents. It's the same as building a building. You may not have to tear down the outside, but you need to put the house on the slope. So it shouldn't. It should just be part of your process.
And one of the things that reminds me of coming back to the aesthetics part of it too, luckily we got rid of that tradition, but if you remember in the 90s when websites were very new, we would have bouncing balls, text on fire, lots of different effects, animated text or animated material. The main reason was that you could do it, and it was very easily done. You could put backgrounds that were very wide and different colors.
They called it bells and whistles from the techies.
So why is that happening? I mean, we're getting rid of that kind of, but you still see some gimmicks happening here and there. Although, would you agree that online design has changed and matured? It's generally much more sensible.
Well, it's matured in the sense that there are very few sites where we have to tell people what to do anymore. Click here. If the color changes, we know it's a link. So, I started working on websites in the early 90s, so there's been a maturity and there's been language that we all have learned, that a color change, various other things will prompt us to do something, so that we don't have the expectations. And the techies no longer feel obliged to show off to each other.
Well, some do.
Some do, yes, some do, but not as a universal.
But, I think it's important that we distinguish between a site like this that helps to facilitate a regular class and what I understand to be online learning, which is people in remote locations not coming to the same place. Because this particular technology, I mean, there are wikis here that probably fourth graders can create that do everything that this does. And that's not the same as a class that 100,000 people around the world are taking, or even 30 people in Norfolk. So I think if the focus is on online, we need to think about that, because that's a whole different thing from this.
So what kind of design differences would you expect there to be?
Well, this is just how you find the syllabus, and how, can the student submit the paper here rather than come by your office, essentially. And do you have papers in the library, or do you post them as PDFs here? This is conceptually very simple, and it is, I think, for me, although it's a little clunky, it's a direct transfer from what I started doing in the 1980s, and I'm sure we all did the same thing whenever we started teaching, maybe not recently, but at some point in the past.
The difference is this is a reference tool, and the rest of the discussion is done about the course.
Yeah, that's a good point, yeah.
So I feel like a lot of people use it as a reference tool. I know of other people in computer science or in engineering that they have their tests, their quizzes, they have lectures up. So Colab is more of a place for the course to happen. And so I don't, even though I already got enough Colab, I feel like it's probably just because everybody uses it as a repository, it's pretty functional as a repository, where you can store your syllabus, you can have readings. So when I was trying to make tests and quizzes, and I think Jennie, you were unfortunately part of this, sign-ups, the more interactive features of Colab, it was very clunky from an authoring perspective. I'm trying to get that. So they have the capability, but it's not necessarily up to speed, I guess, or as easy as it would need to be in order for professors to turn it into perhaps an online learning experience.
Which actually brings me to the important point we all had in mind. Who should professors, like faculty, we can't expect them to be expert programmers. We can't expect them to be expert designers. But if they want to go on and engage in that way, who should make sure that the design and authoring is done properly? Is there anything that faculty can do by themselves?
I just wanted to start, hopefully not going to say anything horribly controversial, but faculty are typically very engaged in their own research, right? And they're not trained as teachers. So first of all, it's sort of getting pedagogy into the classroom. And then after that, on top of that, there's sort of the technological pedagogy, right? So I feel like there are different stages in terms of, again, we can replicate lectures, but maybe there are different pedagogical ways that you can teach, right? So if you don't do that in your normal classroom, you're probably not going to foster that in an online setting, right? So I feel like there's a first, maybe this is me coming from the Curry School of Education and doing professional development. There's the sort of first pass of pedagogical knowledge, and then there's the second pass of technological pedagogy.
For a final question of our part, then we'll get to the open questions. That's a very good question that came up last time as well. Dr. Chiu, you have access to a lot of actual students in K-12 and not higher education. So where do you see the new generation of students? How are they thinking about online learning? Is it as a native environment to them as we imagine? Are they getting bored or excited? Or what is their interaction with online learning?
Well, I don't want to take the stage too much from other people, but
So when we were doing these things that we thought were really cool, like being able to push on a computer, being able to put something warm right next to it, and having the computer actually sense the world around it, taking it to different temperatures, some of the students were just like, oh, okay, computer should do this. Like, so it makes me think that they're growing up with iPads, they're growing up with all of these technological capabilities that we didn't have, and they're just much more fast at using this and expecting this to be the way that things are.
So as you realize, our conversation goes from point to point. It's not as structured or organized because there's so many questions to look at. So what I'd like to do is, first of all, thank our speakers for being here. We'll give them a round of applause for joining us today. I know that you, as people who are involved in this field, as we were going through our conversation, you must have had some issues you wanted to ask or clarify about. Maybe bring something back, maybe talk more in depth about something. Or maybe you just want to criticize Paula. You can do it. If there's any question from any of our listeners.
Since collab is already up and it's difficult to change things very drastically, so we have to work with what we have and try to make the best of what we have. So is there any online course at UVA that has things both aesthetically and design appealing to the online student that we can look at and see what are some of the characteristics of a good online course that is appealing to the online learner, the one that is maybe full-time in Northern Virginia or is a full-time on the UK, and they are all in the same class. So if there's one good example or close to as good as we can get, do you guys, can we share it or can we take a look at it?
That's a great question.
Yes. Do we have to limit it to UVA? Can we just say, is there a best practice example where we can look at? That is a very good question.
I would say the best one that I've seen, I really like the original Coursera computer science courses. Having taken those courses, they're very interactive. So it has to do, of course, with the programming. You can see what you're programming at the same time. And there are sort of interactive elements. Now the other courses on Coursera, it's hit or miss. I mean, there are really good ones and then there are really bad ones. But I feel like some of the engineering, and we've also done a lot of research in this. That's what stands out to me.
So Coursera has done some things in terms of design pretty well, but I think what Dr. Chiu is mentioning is also the interaction component. We're still learning what we can do with it, and some of it is programming. So before designers can maybe say, I would like it to look this way, we need to say, this is what we can do. I can pop this up in here. Maybe I can pop this up. This can be draggable. And then you have to sit down and think like, well, do we want it to be draggable? That adds a whole element of, then you're hiding things, then you're adding a third, the depth component into the page as well. So it's starting to get there. Coursera is clean. It's using a lot of different aspects. It's taking care of typography, which in terms of print material is very important. But I don't know an online environment where I can tell you, this is great. This is exactly how we should go with it. But I think we realize that there's some components here and there that we can use and take tools from. But I don't know. Anybody from our listeners, do you have an online learning experience where you can tell us this platform is actually pretty good?
If you look at some of the software, course authoring software sites out there, like there's Lectora, there's Articulate, Storyline, and Captivate 6. If you look at some of their example classes out there, they're really good. They're interactive, informative, and simulations, etc. They're not just lectures. They're good examples.
There are other platforms like Lore, Canvas, which do provide the learning management system style environments. What I usually see is that there's old school. I mean, this is my own view, so please feel free to disagree. There's the old school way of doing things, which is Blackboard, Moodle, Sakai, which Collab is an example of. It basically is done by programmers. It has all these things you can do. You just know what you do, and you just go there and you add more things to it. And then there's a new group of like Lore, which used to be CourseKit. It became lore. They're borrowing from social media. For instance, there's one example called Schoology. They have completely copied the Facebook environment because they think that this is what we should, both aesthetically but in terms of interaction, should copy. So sociology is one. Then there are other examples like lore is a more traditional thing, but it has a feed. For instance, if you know what an activity feed is, there's a feed of things going on, but it did not solve the problem for us of where is this? Like, should I add it in here? Should I add it in there? So there's some experimentation going on. But the second wave is trying to include social networking elements.
Yeah.
And then I guess we could discuss this. There's a third wave, which I would try to put maybe Coursera on, but wrong way. What I'm thinking, and we could definitely discuss this, is we realize if you want to learn properly, it is a lot of customization. Because if you're teaching a computer science program online, what Dr. Chiu mentioned is I want to write my code and get feedback right away if that code is accurate. I would need that. But if I'm doing math, I need feedback for that. But if I'm doing social studies, then I would like that kind of feedback. So then what we realize is that at the very core level, it really needs to be customized. And I'm thinking if you were a teacher, we all have some teaching or educational experience. When you're sitting in your classroom, you're giving a room, a bunch of chairs, but a large amount of what you prepare. You sit down, maybe cut it with your own scissors, choose the colors. So you really custom build a learning experience. So I'm wondering if there will be an easy way for authoring, which is that we can't always hire a designer and programmer to say, please do this for me.
They keep making those tools easier and easier, but like you were pointing out, they're not well integrated with some of the social media type aspects to it yet. I haven't found anything that has it all in one. Maybe the Schoology, is that?
Schoology, I think, if I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Something like that.
You're right, so usability, authoring becomes very important too. Do you think these are new issues? Because one of the things that is lacking in this environment is perspective. By that I mean relatively young people at the age of 20, 21, they set out to revolutionize online learning. They use words like disrupting education or completely getting rid of teachers, which is, interesting ideas. But let's have a perspective from real educational institutions. There are other types of online learning. Where do you think the trends are really there from a design, education, architecture perspective? Is physical classrooms going to be completely over?
No.
That's all I have to say.
All I say, it's meant to supplement, not supplant, not take the place of. There's nothing you can. The teacher has such a great impact on their students, and so, in my view, it should always be as something that is additional. Like I was saying, it gives students a different type of interaction or different performances that they can get otherwise. Now that being said, I think it's wonderful that people in Afghanistan can be watching lectures of MIT professors and engaging in educational learning throughout their lives. And so I also agree that in some cases maybe if you don't have access to a teacher or a classroom, then online is a wonderful way to bring it up, so to speak.
All right. So is there any more questions from our listeners? Anything you would like to add?
I just have one. I mean, it seems like we're pretty sure that we haven't yet achieved the perfect, maybe not even the good, but you've made a number of references to things that are bad or old school or things that don't work. For those of us who are brand new to this, maybe if you can't tell us exactly how we should do it, are there some obvious things we should not do? Things that just have proven not to work?
What's your field?
Government politics. It sounds like there's a big agreement that just the talking head, 45 minutes of the talking head, does not work. Is that just because we feel like we would get bored with that? I mean, is there some empirical evidence to suggest that people do not like watching this? I wouldn't, but...
Well, I feel like there are different levels. So, on one hand, if you have a lecture available online, somebody can watch it for 8 minutes, put it down, go, put their kid to sleep, they can come back, They can stop it, they can rewind it if they have questions, right? If they don't remember something, they can always come back to it. So there's that sort of simple level of just having something out there on a lecture that actually is beneficial as opposed to just hearing it once and kind of forgetting about it. So it affords those things for play with and sort of revisiting. But then again, there's other levels of interactivity where you are more, you're engaging, you're changing variables. I'm sorry, I'm always thinking through a STEM lens. Or you're engaging in a discussion online where there's more interaction. Usually those types of, if you have learners more active as opposed to passive, then that's generally a good thing. So the more you can get learners to be active, then the more they're going to learn.
And I think you can think about it in parallels of how you teach different class sizes. If you have a seminar of 15, you teach one way. If you have a lecture hall, once it's beyond a certain number, it doesn't matter if you're 60 or 600 people in here, you're going to teach a different way. And so if you take those references that you already know and think about that information to apply it to what you're going to give online, I think that begins to answer some of the questions. The teaching experience you already have.
I think the other thing that universities have a challenge with is a kind of a general skepticism toward the so-called real world. And the real world in this area is just light years ahead of any institution I know of. And so to me it seems like rather than continuing to kind of doggedly do it our own way, we should look outside of the walls of the institution and pull things in. So in your field, I could imagine that your students are watching 24-hour news cycles and, which is both eye reporters in Egypt, or it might be highly produced scripted TV shows, or it might be things like, I don't know, The West Wing or whatever, 24 or whatever those kind of shows are, that there's just been a lot more money put into them, and the people who are really good at doing that stuff are moving into those fields. They're not typically, working at universities. So either we need to hire them ourselves, and occasionally that happens. I'm told that the head of IT at UT Austin is a former Dell executive, so there's that crossover. But otherwise, maybe we can just grab things and bring them in, so that, because I think one of the things that's difficult for our students, and really for us too, is it's just painful to watch things that are so poorly produced when we're so used to seeing things that are incredibly well produced all the time. And so either we have to hire that expertise, which is unlikely, or we have to bring it in as we can. So WordPress, I think, does probably better, websites for faculty members, or as I say, I've done wikis that are more user-friendly than Colab, for example, and then just other content from other places, which is a good way of not only making things that are more sophisticated, at least in clumps, but I think it's also a way to think past the boundaries of the academy.
All right, so I know everybody has appointments and other things to attend to. So I'd like to thank again our speakers. I think they provided us with great insights and great issues to go back and think about. But if you'd like to chat more, please stay behind. I don't know if you have time, if they have nothing else to do, nowhere else to go next. I'm sure they have. But please use these resources and keep in touch about our next event. In a month's time, we will come back and talk about community, and we'll have invited people from psychology, educational anthropology, to say, okay, we've talked about community building a lot, but let's look at what has been happening so far, and what are actual steps you can take to build community. So we'd be happy if you join us next time too, and we'll email you about this as well. So join me again to thank our speakers.